Della Hartwell watched them turn Eli away from the church supper. The hired hand who'd mended the schoolhouse roof for nothing. The man who'd worked through a hailstorm and refused a dime for it. They handed him a plate at the back door. On newspaper, not a dish. Cold beans and a heel of bread laid out on yesterday's headlines passed through the gap in the door like you'd feed a stray. And he thanked them. He thanked them, and he took his newspaper plate, and he sat down on the back step and ate it in the dark while 40 of his neighbors laughed inside where the lamps were warm. That was the first thing. The second came at the Mercantile, a week on. Eli set a nickel on the counter for a cup of coffee, and before the coffee was poured, Vernon Merrick's foreman said it loud. Loud enough for the whole of Main Street to hear. Valley's got no room for drifters who can't pay for the boots they stand in. Eli looked at the coffee he couldn't buy now, not with the whole street watching. He set the nickel back in his pocket. And he walked out. But here's the thing nobody in Cottonwood Bend knew. That same night, Della rode past the old line shack on the river road, and she saw a lamp burning where no lamp should be. She slowed her horse, and through the one dirty window she saw the drifter, the broke man with 9 cents to his name, bent over a stack of land office records thick as a family Bible, reading by that thin light, and in his fist, held tight the way a man holds the one thing he can't lose, a ring. A gold ring he wouldn't set down even to turn a page. She rode on. She told herself it was nothing. It was not nothing. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have looked closer, if you've ever been handed your plate at the back door, this story is for you. Before we go on, do something for me. Subscribe so you don't miss how this valley turns. And in the comments, tell me the town you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this valley travels. Go ahead. I'll wait. Now let me tell it to you right. From the start, Elias Merrick was supposed to be dead. 12 years back, in the spring of 1922, the Merrick Heir went into the Powder River when it was running high and brown with snowmelt. The same season his father took sick and died. The county dragged the banks for 3 days. They found a boot. They found a torn coat. They never found the boy. So they did what people do. They buried an empty box in the Cottonwood Bend churchyard, and they put a stone over it, and the preacher said the boy was with his father now, and the whole valley agreed it was a hard, sad thing. And then the whole valley went on living. The land went to the brother, Vernon Merrick. It was the natural way of it. The elder Merrick dead, the son drowned. Who else would hold the spread but Vernon? So Vernon held it. He held the valley bottom where the water ran. The water every small farmer in the bend leased to keep his beans and his few head alive. He held the big house with the crest carved over the gate. He held all of it, and in 12 years he came to believe, the way a man will, that he had always held it. That it was his by right and not by burial. And now, in the dry and dying summer of 1934, a lean hired hand called only Eli worked fence and busted machinery up and down the valley for meals. You have to understand what 1934 was. Out in the Powder River country of eastern Montana. It was dust. It was banks folding up like paper in the rain. It was good families loading wagons in the night and driving west because the ground had quit on them and the note had come due. The rain hadn't come proper in 3 years. The topsoil got up and walked off in the wind, and it took the mortgages with it, and the whole high plains felt like a house with the lamp guttering low. Into that came Eli. Nobody knew where from. He'd drifted in the winter before, they said, off a freight or off his own 2 feet, and he'd stayed, which drifters mostly don't. He was maybe 34, though the dust and the sun added years to him. He was grease under the nails and dust in the creases, and a quiet that made people uneasy, because folks who talked too little always seemed to be knowing too much. He mended a fence for a plate of eggs. He set a threshing machine right when 3 other men had given up on it, and asked nothing but a night in the barn. He was, the county decided early and firmly, a broke and shiftless drifter, and the county did not revise its verdicts once they were made. Della Hartwell revised hers slower than most, but she had made it too. She kept the one-room school on the rise above the bend. 27 years old, and already a widow, her husband had gone under a wagon 2 winters past, and she'd put away her grief the way she put away chalk at the end of a day, neat and quiet and out of sight. She stayed. She lit the school every morning through the worst of it. When half her pupils came to class hungry and the other half didn't come at all because their people had already given up and gone. She was the valley's quiet conscience, though she'd have laughed to hear it said. She only knew that somebody had to keep the light on for the children, and it might as well be her. It was Della's roof that first made her look twice at the hired hand. The schoolhouse roof had gone bad over the winter, shakes lifted, tar paper torn. A long, wet stripe down the inside wall every time it rained, which was seldom, but ruinous when it came. She had no money for it. The county had no money for it. She'd resigned herself to a bucket and a prayer. Then a hailstorm came up one August afternoon, sudden and mean, the sky going green and low the way it does before it turns on you. And Della, holed up in the school with a dozen frightened children, heard a hammer going on the roof. In the hail. She went out into it, holding her shawl over her head against stones the size of thumbnails, and there was Eli on her roof, coat over his shoulders, nailing down her shakes with the storm coming apart around him. He'd seen the water stripe on the wall when he'd passed by. He'd known it would let go in the first real weather. So he'd climbed up to hold it together with his own 2 hands while it hit. When it passed, she offered him what little she had. 2 bits and a dinner. He wouldn't take the money. Children need a dry room to learn in, he said. That was all. He came down off the roof, and he touched his hat, and he walked back down the road toward whatever barn would have him that night. And Della stood there in the wet, with the hail melting to nothing in the grass, and she thought, no one else in this county would have done that. Not a soul. Not the men who sat in the warm church with their plates on good dishes. Only the drifter, with 9 cents in his pocket and nothing to gain, had climbed up into a storm for a schoolteacher's leaking roof. She didn't know what to do with the thought. So she set it aside, the way you set aside a thing that doesn't fit. But she didn't forget it. The county, meanwhile, went the other way entire. Being kind to Eli became a thing you didn't do. The way there's always some poor soul in a hard place who becomes the one it's safe to be cruel to. Mothers told their children not to speak to the drifter. At the mercantile, men made a show of counting their change loud when he came in, as if he'd take it. When the church held its harvest supper. The one bright, warm evening of that whole bitter year, and Eli came because someone had told him, wrongly, that all were welcome, they gave him his plate at the back door on newspaper. And you know now how that went. There was a reason the county was so quick to it, though nobody said the reason out loud. It was Vernon. Vernon Merrick set the tune, and the valley danced to it, because Vernon held the water. Every man who leased Merrick water knew better than to be seen befriending a man Vernon had no use for. And Vernon had made plain, in the offhand cruel way of a man who's never been told no, that the drifter was beneath his notice. He called him the drifter the way you'd name a dog you didn't like. Once, from his buggy, passing Eli on the road, Vernon had said to the man beside him, loud, "Look at that. My brother worked this valley 40 years, and the good Lord sends us that to walk his ground." He'd laughed. And Eli, walking, had not turned his head. So that was Cottonwood Bend in the summer of 1934. A dying valley, a proud man on the good land, a schoolteacher keeping the light, and a hired hand carrying something in his fist that no one had thought to look at. Now let me tell you about the land office. Because it starts there, though nobody knew it was starting. Amos Cutright had been the county recorder for 31 years. He was 58, and he wanted nothing on this earth but a quiet life, and a warm stove, and to be left alone with his ledgers until he could retire on his little pension and die in his bed. He kept the record of every deed and claim and transfer in the county in a row of great bound books along one wall, And he knew those books the way a shepherd knows his hills, not every stone. But the lay of the whole. Della came in one August morning to file the school's fuel voucher, and while Amos hunted his stamp, she made talk to fill the quiet. "Land's changing hands fast this year," she said. "Half the valley's up for the bank, seems like." Amos didn't look up. "Half the valley's been rewrote once already. When the elder Merrick passed. Whole book's a mess from that year, always was. Deeds redone, claims moved around. He found his stamp, nobody ever untangled it, nobody had cause to. He brought the stamp down on her voucher with a thump. There you are, Mrs. Hartwell." Della took her paper and thanked him and went out into the heat, and she did not register a single word of what he'd said. Why would she? It was land office talk, dull as weather. Deeds rewrote after old Merrick died. So what? Old men died and their papers got sorted, that was the whole of the world. She didn't hear it. The county didn't hear it. But you heard it. Hold on to it. A deed, recorded before the will everyone knew, still sitting in Amos Cutright's ledger, forgotten as an old man's mutter. Now the pressure came on. It came, as it always does, on a printed notice tacked to a post. The Cottonwood Valley Trust, the bank in the county seat that held the paper on half the country, posted that the Merrick spread, run now by Vernon, carried a balloon note, $3,840, due entire, in 44 days. Pay it or the valley bottom sold at auction to the syndicate. The syndicate. That was the word that went through the bend like a cold wind. Railroad landmen out of the east buying up failing spreads for pennies, meaning to run them dry or fence them or sell them on. And the Merrick bottom wasn't just the Merrick bottom. It was the water. Every small farmer in the valley leased that water. If the syndicate took it, they'd not lease it back, they'd bleed it or wall it. And the whole valley would empty inside a year. Every family in the bend would be on the road west with the rest of the Dust Bowl dead. So it wasn't Vernon's trouble anymore. It was everyone's. 44 days, and then the valley either held or it died. And this is where Vernon showed the valley what he was, though the valley was too frightened to read it. Vernon Merrick did not fight the note. He welcomed it. Because Vernon had already made his own arrangement with the syndicate. A private sale, quiet on terms that lined his pockets, that he meant to close before the note ever came due. He'd let the note push everyone to panic, and in the panic he'd sell the valley out from under all of them and be gone east a rich man before they understood what he'd done. The foreclosure was his cover. He wasn't drowning. He was the one holding the others under. The valley didn't see that. The valley just saw the notice on the post and counted its 44 days and got afraid. And in that fear, it needed someone to be angry at. It always does. It found Eli. I'll tell you how it happened, because it's the day the whole county showed its face, and Della saw it show, and something in her began to turn. It was a Saturday. Main Street was full, 40 souls or more. In for what little trading anyone could afford, all of them nervy with the note hanging over the valley. Eli had come in to spend his 9 cents on coffee and salt. The sum of what he had in the world. And Harlan Poe, Vernon's foreman, Vernon's mouth and Vernon's fist, decided the day needed a drifter in it. Poe came out of the feed store loud. "Sack of oats gone from my wagon," he called down the street. "And there's the man take it." He pointed at Eli. "You. Empty your pockets." Eli stood still. "I've taken nothing. Then it costs you nothing to show me." Poe was already coming, and 2 men with him, and the whole street turning to watch. Glad, you could see it, glad to have something to look at that wasn't their own fear. "Turn 'em out, or I'll turn 'em out for you." There's a kind of quiet a man carries when he has decided, long ago and all the way down, that he will not be provoked. Eli had that quiet. He looked at Poe for a long moment. And then, slow, he emptied his pockets onto the boardwalk in front of the crowd. 9 cents. A folding knife worn thin. a twist of string, and, last, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth, a small hard thing he did not want to set down. Poe grabbed for it. "What's that, then?" Eli's hand closed over it, fast, the only fast thing he'd done. "That's mine," he said. And there was something in how he said it. Not a drifter's whine, not a beggar guarding a beggar's coin, but flat and certain, the voice of a man stating a fact of law that made Poe hesitate half a breath. Then the crowd murmured, and Poe remembered his audience, and he laughed it off. "Keep your trinket. 9 cents and a bit of brass. That's your fortune, is it, drifter?" And from the edge of the street, from his buggy where he'd been sitting the whole time watching it like a show put on for him, Vernon Merrick spoke. "Let the drifter keep his trinket." Vernon's voice carried. He meant it to. "It's the only thing in this valley that'll ever be his." The street laughed. 40 souls laughing at a man kneeling to gather 9 cents off a boardwalk. And Della Hartwell, who had come out of the mercantile at the noise, pushed through them. "Stop it." She said it before she'd thought it. "Stop it, all of you. This man fixed my roof in a hailstorm and wouldn't take a cent. He's mended half your fences for a plate of beans. And you'll stand here and paw through his pockets because Harlan Poe lost a sack of oats he likely spilled himself." She was shaking. She wasn't a woman who raised her voice. "Shame on you. Shame on the whole street of you." The laughing stopped. Not because they were shamed, Della saw that, and it was the bitter part, but because a respectable widow scolding them had made the sport awkward. They drifted off, muttering, Poe spat and went back for his wagon. Vernon clicked to his horse and rolled on, unbothered, already forgetting. Eli stood, his pockets loaded back up, the oilcloth thing safe in his fist. He looked at Della. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "You didn't have to do that," he said finally. "Somebody did." No, he looked at her. And it was the first time she'd ever seen anything in his face but that closed quiet. For just a moment, something almost like grief, or gratitude, or both. Somebody didn't. That's the point. Nobody in this county had to, and you did. He touched his hat. "I'm obliged, Mrs. Hartwell," and he walked away up the street, past the buggy tracks. And Della stood there full of a feeling she couldn't name and didn't like, because she'd defended him out of pity, out of pure human decency at seeing a man abused, and something in the way he'd said nobody didn't told her that pity was the wrong-shaped thing to be feeling. That she was still, even in defending him, looking at him through the county's eyes. Seeing a poor abused drifter. And not seeing whatever it was he actually was. She didn't sleep well that night. The humiliation didn't break Eli. That was the thing that unsettled the county most. If they'd stopped to notice it, a broken man they'd have understood. But Eli went on exactly as he'd been, quiet and steady, as though the whole street's cruelty had rolled off him like water off a slicker. He went on mending what wanted mending. And at night, he went to the old line shack on the river road, and he lit his lamp, and he read. Della knew now what the lamp meant, because she'd seen it that once through the window. Land office records. The broke man with his stack of deeds, reading by thin light, the ring always in reach on the table beside him. She told herself a story about it, to make it fit. She decided he was a poor man chasing a poor man's dream, that he'd got some notion into his head about a claim somewhere, some worthless piece of blown-out ground he thought was owed him. And he was killing his nights over a fool's hope. It was sad, she decided. It was the kind of thing a man clings to when he's got nothing else. She felt sorry for him. Do you hear it? She still felt sorry for him. She still had it wrong. But she couldn't leave it alone. And so one evening, ashamed of her county and half drawn to the man in a way she wasn't ready to look at square, she took a good lamp, a real one, with clean oil, better than the guttering thing he had, and she rode out to the line shack and she knocked on the door. He opened it careful. When he saw it was her, and saw the lamp, something crossed his face. "I thought," she said, and felt foolish, "you could use a better light." for your reading." He looked at the lamp. He looked at her. And then he stepped back and let her in, which she hadn't expected, and which she understood later was a thing he almost never did, let anyone in, anywhere near the table where the records were. The shack was bare and clean, a cot, a stove, a table. And on the table, the books. Not one worthless claim as she'd imagined. Ledgers, survey maps, deed abstracts, water right filings, the dense dry paper of who owns what going back years. She set the lamp down and its good light fell across all of it, and she looked, and she did not understand what she was looking at, but she understood it was not a fool's hope. It was too much, too ordered. A fool's hope is a scrap of paper cried over. This was a man building something, brick by brick, in the dark. "What is all this?" she asked. "Water," he said, which was true, and told her nothing and she'd learn later was the most he could safely say. She didn't press. She sat, and she watched him work a while, and she saw the things she'd tell herself about for weeks after. There was a stud horse in the corral behind the shack, a big spoiled roan the last owner had left, mean as sin, that no wrangler in the valley would put a hand on. It had half killed a man that spring. As Della sat, the horse got to fussing at something in the dark, screaming and slamming the rails, and Eli got up like it was nothing and went out to it. Della followed to the door, afraid, and she watched the broke drifter walk up to that killing horse in the dark, slow, talking low, no rope, no whip. And the horse that had put a man in a bed for a month, dropped its head and blew and went still and let Eli put a hand flat on its neck like they'd known each other 20 years. "How did you?" She started. "You don't fight a thing that's scared," Eli said, not turning. "You just let it know you're not the thing to be scared of." They went back in. And to cover her own unease, Della asked him something about the valley, some idle thing about the water and who held what. And Eli answered. He answered for 10 minutes without once looking at a page. He laid out the whole water rights map of the valley from memory, this creek to that headgate, this filing before that one, who leased from whom, which claim was senior and which was junior. The elder Merrick's original filings and how the water had been parceled 40 years back and every change since. He knew it the way you know the rooms of the house you grew up in the dark, with your eyes shut. He knew this land, this exact valley, like it was written on the inside of him. And Della sat very still, and the thought she'd set aside on the day of the hailstorm came back and would not be set aside again. This was no drifter. A drifter doesn't carry the water map of a valley in his skull. A drifter doesn't gentle the horse that no local man can touch. A drifter blows into a country and knows nothing of it and blows out again. This man knew Cottonwood Bend the way only a man born to it could know it. She didn't know what that meant yet. But she knew, riding home that night under the dry Montana stars, that she had been wrong about him from the first day, and wrong in a bigger way than she'd guessed, and that the pity she'd been carrying was an insult she'd been paying him without knowing it. She just didn't yet know what to put in its place. The next week the note came alive. The Cottonwood Valley Trust made good on its threat and drove it home. A foreclosure notice, the formal one, black-bordered, dated and stamped, was nailed to the Merrick gate under the carved crest, where every soul passing on the county road would see it. 44 days had become half that. The valley bottom, the water, all of it, to be sold at public auction on the courthouse steps if the note wasn't cleared. And Vernon Merrick, who should by rights have been sick with the losing of it, moved faster instead. Word got around that he'd been to the county seat twice in a week, closeted with the syndicate men. He wasn't scrambling to save the spread. He was hurrying to sell it, hurrying to close his private deal and be gone before the auction ever happened. So he'd have the syndicate's money in his pocket and none of the valley's grief on his conscience. He set the machinery of it turning fast. An auction date was pushed for. The clock, which had been 44 lazy days, tightened to a hard short thing everyone could feel. Della saw the notice on the gate and felt the cold of it. Everyone did. But she saw something else too, because she'd been to the line shack now, and she couldn't unsee it. She saw the crest carved in the wood over the black-bordered paper. The Merrick crest, old, weathered, cut deep by some craftsman 40 years gone. And she'd seen that shape somewhere else. Recently, she knew she had. It nagged at her the whole ride home, and she couldn't place it. And it wasn't until she was lying awake that night that it came to her, and when it came she sat straight up in the dark. The ring. The thing in the oilcloth. The thing Poe had grabbed for and Eli had guarded like his life. The thing that sat on the table at the line shack, always in reach. She'd glimpsed it clean, just once, that evening, when he'd set it down to turn a map. And the good lamplight had caught it, a heavy gold signet, worn but deep cut, a shape stamped into the face of it. The same shape, the crest over the gate. The crest over the gate she could not have described an hour before, but now, with the ring beside it in her mind, she saw they were the same. The Merrick crest. Carved in the wood the family had owned for 40 years, and carried, wrapped in oilcloth, in the fist of a penniless drifter who knew the valley like blood and gentled the Merrick land's meanest horse and read the Merrick deeds by lamplight in a line shack. Della Hartwell lay in the dark, and her pity curdled all the way into a question. And the question was so large she was afraid of it. Who was he? She didn't ask it. Not yet. You don't walk up to a man and ask a thing like that. She wasn't even sure she had the right of it, and part of her was afraid she did. So she carried it, unasked, for days, watching him different now. Watching the way he stood, the way he looked at the big house when he passed it, the way something went across his face and got put away. Eli, for his part, had made a decision of his own. Because the auction date changing had changed his sums too. He'd been building his brick wall slow, night by night, careful, meaning to have every piece in place before he moved. A man who'd learned the hardest way there is that a poor man who moves too soon gets buried. But Vernon rushing the sale had taken the slow away from him. If the spread sold to the syndicate before he could act, then everything he'd come back for was gone. The water leases would die. The small farmers would scatter. And the one thing that could set it all right would be sold off with the rest. And lost. So he did the thing he'd been circling for months. And he did it quiet, and he did it lawful, and he told no living soul his reason. At first light one morning, before the county seat was awake, before Amos Cutright had his stove warm, Eli walked into the land office. He didn't ask for money, he didn't ask for mercy, he didn't ask for a lawyer or a loan or a friend. He set his dusty hat on the counter and he said, in that flat, certain voice, Mr. Cutright, I'd like to see the recording book for 1921 and 22. The bound volume. The one nobody's opened in a while. Amos looked up from his stove, an old man squinting at a hired hand at dawn. That's a strange thing to want. It's a public record, Eli said. A man can ask to see a public record. A man can. Amos looked at him a while longer, and something moved behind the old eyes, some flicker, some half-thing, gone before it landed. The county recorder, who wanted nothing but a quiet life, looked at the drifter across his counter and felt, for reasons he couldn't have named, that his quiet life had just come to an end. He can at that. He got up, slow, and he went to the wall of great bound books. His finger moved along the cracked spines, the years, and stopped. And he pulled down the volume for 1921 and 1922, the one from the messy year, the year everything got rewrote. The book that nobody had opened, because nobody had ever had cause. He set it on the counter between them. Dust came up off it in the dawn light. And that's where I have to leave you tonight. Right there, with the drifter and the old recorder, and that forgotten book lying shut on the counter between them. Because what's written inside it is going to turn this whole valley over. It's going to name a dead man. And it's going to cost somebody everything. Amos Cutright opened the book. He didn't do it fast. He wet his thumb and he turned the great stiff pages, one at a time. and the dust rose and settled in the dawn light coming through the front glass. Eli stood across the counter and said nothing. He had learned, over 12 years, how to wait. The pages were a mess. Amos hadn't lied about that. Deeds crossed out and rewrote. Margins full of a dead man's cramped hand, whole parcels moved from one column to another in the bad year. The year of the flood and the funerals, when half the valley changed owners and nobody had the heart or the time to keep it clean. And then Amos stopped turning. His finger had come down on a line near the bottom of a left-hand page. An entry from 1921. Older than the rest. Written in a steadier hand, before the mess, before the flood. Amos read it once to himself. Then he read it again. And the old man went very still. "Well now," he said, soft. Eli leaned in. "Read it to me." Amos read it. His voice came out thin. "Recorded this 11th day of October, 19 and 21. The valley bottom, the water, and the home section, deeded whole and clear by Josiah Merrick to his son. To my son Elias, it says, and them that come after him." Amos looked up over his spectacles. "That's the whole spread, everything Vernon's fixing to sell. Deeded to the boy a full year before the will. The office was quiet. Out on the street a dog barked once and quit. There's a will filed after," Amos said slowly, working it out as he spoke, the way an old careful man does. 18 and 92. No, 19 and 22. Filed spring of 22. Leaves it all to the brother. To Vernon. On account of the boy drowned. He set his hand flat on the page. But a will can't give away what a deed already gave. And this deed come first. This deed's got the boy's name on it, and it's been sitting in my book a dozen years, and not one living soul ever asked to see it." He looked up at the hired hand. And there was that flicker again. The half thing that had crossed his face at the counter. But this time it landed, this time it stayed. "You're a young man," Amos said. "But you ain't as young as you play. I recorded a boy's name in this book once. Elias," he said it careful. "You favor your father around the mouth." Eli didn't answer that. He reached over and he closed the book, gentle, his hand spread on the cover the way a man puts his hand on a Bible. "Keep it safe," was all he said. 9 days. He means to sell on the steps in 9 days. Keep it safe till then. And he took his dusty hat off the counter and he walked out into the morning. Now here is what the county could not see. Here is what only you and I can see, holding this book open in the dark. The valley had it all backwards. They had a rope half braided for the drifter. They had him marked a thief and a nobody and a beggar who ate off newspaper at the back door. And the whole time, the truth of who owned the ground under their feet was lying flat in a dusty ledger not 200 feet from the mercantile where they'd shamed him. It had been there the day they turned him from the supper. It had been there the day Poe emptied his pockets on Main Street. It had been there all along, patient as stone, waiting on one man to walk in at dawn and ask. That is the cruelest and the sweetest thing about a written record. It doesn't care who's laughing. It just waits. Della Hartwell found him the next evening at the line shack. She had brought him a lamp weeks before, a good one, and she brought oil for it now, and she told herself that was why she came. It was not the whole reason. She had seen the ring by then, seen it clean in the lamplight one night, the crest, the little rearing horse and the crossed rule, and she had seen that same crest carved deep in the sandstone over the Merrick gate every day of her married life. She had not slept well since. He was at the table when she came in, no records tonight. Just the ring, out of its oilcloth, sitting in the middle of the boards where he could look at it. "I'll ask you a thing," Della said. She set the oil down. She did not sit. "And I'll ask it plain. Because I'm a plain woman, and I've had my fill of this valley's whispering. That ring on the table. It's the Merrick crest. The same one over the gate, Vernon's crest." "It's not Vernon's," Eli said. "Then whose?" He was quiet a moment. Outside, the wind came down off the brakes and worried at the shack. "Sit down, Mrs. Hartwell," he said. "I'll tell you." I've told no one in 12 years, and I don't rightly know why I'll tell you, except you're the only soul in this county fed me like a man instead of a dog." He turned the ring with one finger. "And I'm tired. I'll say that too. A man can be strong a long time and still get tired." She sat. "My name is Elias Merrick," he said. The lamp hissed. Della did not move. "Josiah Merrick was my father. Vernon is my father's brother, my uncle." He said the word without heat, which was somehow worse than if he'd spat it. 12 years back, the spring I was 22, the Powder come up over its banks, worst flood in 40 years. My father took sick that same week and died in his bed. And I went into the river trying to pull our stock off the low ground, and the water took me under and it carried me off." "They buried you," Della said. Her voice had gone to a whisper. "There's a box in the Cottonwood Bend churchyard. A headstone. I've walked past it 100 times. Elias Merrick, it says." "There's a box," Eli agreed. "There's nothing in it. They found a boot of mine downriver, and a piece of my coat tore off on a snag, and that was enough for the county. Enough for a funeral. Enough for a will." He looked at her. "But I didn't drown. I fetched up on a sandbar 4 miles down, half dead, lungs full of the river. A sheepherder found me. Basque fellow, didn't speak but a dozen words of English. Kept me in his wagon a whole winter while I learned to walk again and remember my own name." 12 years, Della said. "By the time I could sit a horse and think straight, it was done. My father in the ground. Me in the ground so far as anybody knew, and my Uncle Vernon holding the whole spread on a will nobody thought to question. Why would they? The heir was dead. There was a stone with his name on it. His mouth moved, not quite a smile. I was a penniless boy come back from the dead with a story nobody would believe and not one scrap of paper to my name. You think this county'd have listened to me then? A ragged kid claiming to be a Merrick? They'd have laughed me out of the valley. Or worse. So you waited." "So I waited." He wrapped the ring back in its oilcloth. Slow, I knew there had to be something. "My father was a careful man. Carefuler than Vernon ever gave him credit for. He deeded me that ground the year before he died. I stood in the land office and watched him do it. I was a grown man. I remember the day. Amos Cutright wrote it in his book with his own hand. And a deed like that doesn't go away just because a boy drowns. It sits, it waits in the ledger." He looked at her across the little table. "I came back a hired hand to get near that book without a soul knowing why. I mended fence for meals. I let them feed me on newspaper. I let Poe turn out my pockets in front of the whole town. Because the day I said my name out loud was the day Vernon learned I was alive. And I only get to say it once. And I had to say it standing on the deed, not before." Della sat there a long while. The schoolteacher who had pitied him, who had first read him the way the whole county read him, a broke man chasing a fool's hope by lamplight. She felt that pity turn over inside her and become something else. Shame first, then a kind of awe. Then anger, not at him. At herself, and at every man and woman in Cottonwood Bend who had looked at Elias Merrick and seen a drifter, because a drifter was the easy thing to see. "They fed you on newspaper," she said, "and you own the plate." "I own the whole table," Eli said quietly. "In 9 days I aim to prove it, if Vernon don't stop me first." He tried. God knows Vernon Merrick tried. Harlan Poe carried the word to him that the drifter had been seen at the land office 2 mornings running asking after old books. Vernon was in his study when he heard it, and the premise of the thing came to him slow and then all at once, and the blood went out of his face and left it hard. "What book?" he said. "Old recording book is what Cutright's girl says. The messy one. 21, 22. Vernon Merrick was 51 years old, and he had not thought about that flood or that funeral in a long time. He had put an empty box in the ground, and he had slept fine every night since, because the boy was dead and the record was buried, and there was no power on this earth that could untangle what he'd tangled. He had been certain of it. Certain as sunrise. He was not certain now. "He's a drifter," Vernon said, but his voice had a crack in it he didn't like. "He's a nobody with a story." "Yes, sir," said Poe. "But he keeps asking after that book." So Vernon Merrick moved, the way a cornered man moves, fast and dirty and all at once. First he went at the book. He couldn't burn a county record, not with Cutright standing guard over it, but a book can be misplaced. There was a fire safe in the back of the land office and a storeroom behind that. And Vernon paid a clerk 2 months' wages to see that the 1921-22 volume got moved off its shelf and lost among the tax rolls where no man could find it in 9 days. Amos protested. Amos was told, cold, by Vernon Merrick himself, that an old man near his pension ought to think hard about his quiet years ahead. Then he went at Eli. The feed theft charge had never gone away. Poe had seen to that, kept it warm, an old coal ready to blow on. 3 days before the auction, 2 men rode out to the line shack before dawn and took Elias Merrick off the mean roan stud he'd gentled with his own hands. And they put him in the county jail on the sworn word of Harlan Poe that this drifter had stolen feed from the Merrick barn. No bail set. Not for a nobody. He would sit in that cell, Vernon meant, straight through auction day, and by the time anybody let him out the valley bottom, would belong to the syndicate and there'd be nothing left to claim. And then he leaned on the bank. He rode into the Cottonwood Valley Trust and he told them to close the sale early. Skip the steps. Sell private to the syndicate the morning of, get the paper signed before noon, and let any fool who came after argue with a done deal. 3 days out, it looked like Vernon Merrick had won. The deed was lost in the tax rolls, the heir was locked in a cell 9 feet square. The bank was greased. The syndicate's man was already in town, sleeping at the hotel with a bank draft in his coat. The clock had $400 and something and 44 days ago on it, and now it had run down to almost nothing, and the man who could stop it couldn't get his hands through the bars. That is the all is lost. I won't pretty it up for you. There was a night in there, the night before auction day, where a lesser man would have quit. Eli sat in that cell in the dark, and the whole thing he'd built over 12 patient years was coming apart in his hands, and he could not touch it. But he was not the only one working now. Because Della Hartwell had heard her name at last. She went to Amos Cutright first, and she found an old man wrestling his conscience, and losing to it, which is to say, winning. Amos had been recorder 31 years. He had a pension coming and a quiet retirement he wanted more than anything in the world, and Vernon Merrick had made it plain that both were his to lose. But Amos had sat awake too. He had recorded a boy's deed with his own hand in 1921, and he had recorded that same boy's death a year later, and he had a thing in his chest that 31 years of quiet had not killed. They moved the book, Amos told her, low, in the back of the office. Vernon's men. It's in the storeroom under the tax rolls, buried, but... And here the old man reached into a card drawer and drew out a small yellowed index card, worn soft at the corners. They moved the book. They never touched my index. Every deed I ever recorded, I made a card. 31 years of cards. And here's the boys. He held it up. His hand shook. 1921. Elias Merrick. Volume and page. The book can hide, Mrs. Hartwell, but the book don't lie, and I know exactly what shelf to pull it off of, and Vernon Merrick can burn my pension, but I'll be damned if he burns my ledger. Della did the one thing a schoolteacher knows how to do better than anyone in a county. She got the right people in the right room at the right hour. There was a circuit judge in town, Judge Harmon, come through for the fall session and staying over to see the big Merrick auction with the rest of the county. Della went to him at the hotel, and she talked plain, the way she talked to everyone, and she laid it out. A deed, a will, a dead man who wasn't dead, an old recorder ready to swear. The judge was a careful man. He did not promise her much. But he promised her he'd be on the courthouse steps at midday, and that a sale could wait 1 hour on the word of a county officer. And she went to the jail, and through the bars she told Elias Merrick that the book was found, and the judge would hear it, and to hold on one more day. "You brought a judge," Eli said. He was looking at her through the iron like a man not sure of what he was seeing. "I brought the whole county," Della said. "The same 40 souls that watched them turn out your pockets. They'll be on those steps for the auction anyhow. Let them watch this instead." Auction day. It was warm for the season, and the whole of Cottonwood Bend came out for it. Because when a valley's water goes on the block, every farmer for 20 miles has a stake. They filled Main Street, and they filled the courthouse steps, the 40 and more. The same faces, the women from the church supper, the men from the mercantile, the children told not to talk to the drifter, now up on their father's shoulders to see. The syndicate's man stood near the front in a good Eastern coat, the bank's man beside him with the papers. And Vernon Merrick came in his buggy, sitting up straight and easy, because as far as Vernon knew the heir was in a cell and the book was buried, and this was the morning he turned the valley into money. The auctioneer got up on the top step. He had a paper in his hand, and he'd got as far as clearing his throat when Judge Harmon stood up out of the crowd. "Hold," the judge said. Not loud. He didn't have to be loud. "There's a matter of record to be heard before this ground is sold. County recorder to the steps." And the crowd turned, and up the steps came old Amos Cutright, 58 years old, 31 years in the job, carrying a great dusty-bound book in both arms like it weighed as much as he did. Behind him came Della Hartwell. And behind her, blinking in the daylight, brought from the jail on the judge's own order, Eli, Vernon Merrick came up out of his buggy seat. "Your Honor, that man's a thief awaiting trial. He'll keep," said the judge. "Mr. Cutright, you've a recording to read. Read it." Amos set the book down on the auctioneer's own table, up there on the top step where the whole street could see. He put on his spectacles. His hands were not steady, but his voice, when it came, was 31 years of reading records aloud, and it did not fail him now. "Recorded the 11th day of October, 19 and 21, Amos read, and the street went quiet the way a church goes quiet. In the county land office, by me, Amos Cutright, recorder, Josiah Merrick, being of sound mind, does deed the valley bottom, the water rights entire, and the home section of the Merrick spread, whole, clear, and forever, to his son, to Elias Merrick, and to his heirs after him." A sound went through the crowd. Not a word. Just breath, 40 people drawing breath at once. "That's a fraud," Vernon said, but his voice was wrong now. "Hi," the boy drowned. "There's a will. There's a will," Amos agreed. And here the old man reached into the book and drew out a second paper, folded, that he'd carried inside the cover. "Filed by Vernon Merrick, spring of 19 and 22. Leaves the whole spread to himself, on account of the heir being deceased." He unfolded it. He held it up beside the ledger. "It's witnessed. It's notarized. Notarized by one Thomas Speed, notary of this county." Amos looked out over his spectacles, and for the first time that morning something like anger came into the old man's voice. "I buried Tom Speed. I stood at his grave. Tom Speed died in the January of 19 and 22, and this will is notarized by his hand in the March following. 2 months after we put him in the ground." The street made no sound at all. "A dead man," Amos said into that silence, "does not notarize a will." I want you to look at Vernon Merrick's face now, because this is the moment the whole thing was built for. 12 years of a hired hand eating off newspaper. 12 years of one patient man waiting on one dusty book. It all comes down to the color draining out of one arrogant face on the courthouse steps at noon. He'd had the notary date forged. That's the thing he'd never thought a soul would catch. He'd needed a witness and a seal to make the will hold. And old Tom Speed's stamp was in a drawer, and who counts the months on a dead notary? Vernon had gambled that no one in 100 years would lay the will's date against the man's own grave. He'd forgotten there was a recorder in this county who buried his friends and kept his cards and forgot nothing. Vernon opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He looked at the syndicate man, and the syndicate man had already taken one step back. the way a man steps back from something dead in the road. He looked at the banksman, and the banksman was quietly folding his papers away. Judge Harmon looked down at the ledger a long moment. Then he looked up. "The deed is prior," he said. "The deed is genuine, recorded, and clear. The will is a forgery on its face. No dead man notarizes anything. And this court will be looking hard at who forged it. There is no note to foreclose that stands against a title the mortgagor never rightly held." He turned. "The valley bottom, the water, and the home section belong, and have belonged since October of 1921 to Elias Merrick. If he stands among us, let him come up." And Ely walked up the courthouse steps, past the syndicate man, past the bank, past his uncle. He didn't hurry, and he didn't gloat, and he didn't say a word, and that silence was the loudest thing on that street. The same 40 souls who had watched Harlan Poe empty his pockets watched him climb. And one by one they did a thing a crowd rarely does. They took their hats off. There was a woman near the front. She'd been at the church supper. She'd been one of the hands that passed him a plate at the back door on a sheet of newspaper, and when Elias Merrick came level with her, she could not hold his eye. She looked down at her own shoes. And that friend was the whole county apologizing in the only way shame knows how. He stopped at the top, and Amos Cutright, 31 years a recorder, handed him the book. Now here is where a smaller man would have made them pay. Here is where the story could have turned mean, and I'll tell you true, I've read 100 that do. The heir takes the spread, throws the leeches off the land, evicts the small farmers who mocked him, salts the earth behind him, and rides off rich. That is not what Elias Merrick did, and that is why I've kept you here to the end of it. The syndicate's man cleared his throat and stepped up, quick, sensing money still. "Mr. Merrick, the eastern interests I represent would pay handsomely for the water rights alone, and with the note voided you're free to—" "The water's not for sale," Eli said. First words he'd spoken on those steps. "It wasn't for sale in my father's time, and it's not for sale in mine." He looked out over the crowd, the farmers, the men who leased his water to keep their little places alive, the men who'd have gone under to the last one if the syndicate had won. "Every lease on this valley bottom stands. Same terms my father set. Nobody's ditch runs dry on my account." He turned to the banksman. "There's a note. $3,840. He said the figure exact. He'd carried it in his head for 44 days like everyone else in that valley. It was borrowed against ground that wasn't rightly borrowed against. But there's men in this county leased under it, and I won't have a cloud on their water while lawyers argue. It'll be paid out of the estate. Today, if your paper's in order, take the trust off this valley and keep it off." The banksman blinked. Then he nodded, slow, because money offered is money, and the note was good. And that was the whole valley saved. Not just Elias Merrick's home section. Every small farmer who'd ever cursed the drifter and told his children to keep clear of him, saved by the drifter with the drifter's own money. Standing on the drifter's own ground. Then, last, the judge nodded to the sheriff, and they came for Vernon. He'd sat back down in his buggy somewhere in all of it, small now, gray. An old man who'd been certain of a thing his whole life and watched the thing come undone in the space of 10 minutes. They took his elbow, gentle enough. A man's not dangerous once the ground's gone out from under him. And as they walked him past the steps he stopped, and he looked up at his brother's son, and he said the only thing he had left to say. "You were dead," Vernon said. Bewildered, almost, like it was the world that had cheated, and not him. "You were dead, boy. I put you in the ground myself." Eli looked down at him, and he did not gloat, and he did not rage, and he gave his uncle one dry line, and it was enough. "The land wasn't," he said. They led Vernon Merrick off down Main Street to answer for a forged will and a dead man's stolen name, and the county he'd meant to sell out from under stood on the steps and watched him go, and not one soul spoke up for him. The county's silence was the sentence. Eli never had to raise his voice. There was one thing more. Harlan Poe stood at the bottom of the steps. The foreman. The mouth. The man who had said, loud enough for 40 souls, that the valley had no room for drifters who couldn't pay for the boots they stood in. The man who had turned out Elias Merrick's pockets on that same street and found 9 cents and a rag-wrapped ring. The sheriff turned to him. Merrick's keys, Harlan, the house, the barns, the gate. You carry them. Hand them over. And Harlan Poe walked up the street he had shamed a Merrick on, in front of the same crowd, and he took the ring of keys off his belt, and he held them out to the man he'd called a drifter. Eli took them. He didn't say a word to Poe. Somehow that was worse than anything he could have said. 1 year later. It's spring again on the Powder River country, and I wish you could see the valley bottom the way it is now. The snowmelts come down off the breaks, and the water's running, and it's running in the small farmers' ditches, every one of them, because the man who owns the water kept every lease he promised to keep. Green coming up where there'd have been dust if the syndicate had won. 40 little places still standing that had no business still standing in the worst years this country ever saw. The one-room school's been re-roofed. Properly this time, not patched through a hailstorm by a hired hand who wouldn't take pay, but shingled square and paid for out of the Merrick estate, because the man who owns the estate remembers who kept the school lit when nobody thought he was worth a plate at supper. Della Hartwell still teaches there, and these days, when she tells the valley's history to the children, she tells them about the crest carved over the Merrick gate, the little rearing horse, the crossed rule, and she tells it as history now, and not as gossip. She tells them what a written record is, and how it waits, and how it doesn't care who's laughing. The signet ring isn't hidden anymore. No more oilcloth. No more fist. Elias Merrick wears it plain on his hand, the way his father wore it, and nobody in Cottonwood Bend needs to ask whose it is. Amos Cutright got his quiet retirement after all. 31 years, and then he laid the great books down and went home, and he sits on his own porch now, and every man in the valley tips his hat when they pass. Because they all know what an old recorder's stubbornness was worth on one particular morning. And if you rode out to the home section some evening, you'd find the two of them, Elias and Della, on the porch of the house he was born in. Not much said between them. There doesn't need to be. A widow and a man come back from the dead, watching the water run in the last light, on ground that finally knows its own name. Here's the thing I've turned over, telling you this. The valley didn't change hands that day on the courthouse steps. That's what everybody thought they were watching. A spread changing owners. It wasn't. The valley only remembered whose hands it had always been in. The deed was true the whole time. The name was right the whole time. Everybody just needed one patient man, and one honest old recorder, and one schoolteacher who finally looked closer to read it out loud. They fed him on newspaper at the back door. And he owned the whole table the entire time. So the next time you're tempted to size a man up by his empty pockets, the drifter, the hired hand, the quiet one nobody counts, you remember Elias Merrick. And you look a little closer. Because you never do know whose ground you're standing on. That's the story of the Merrick Valley, friend. Thank you for writing it out with me to the end. If it stayed with you, comment the town you're watching from. I'd truly like to see how far this valley travels.